Welcome back. So while the Cuban Missile Crisis, at least from the American perspective or the Kennedy perspective, may have ended in 13 days, obviously there was much more that happened after the peaceful resolution of the crisis. And we're so pleased now to have David Coleman from the Miller Center at the University of Virginia to talk about his new book called The 14th Day. David.
Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here to talk about the book that Tom just mentioned, The 14th Day, JFK and the Aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis. As we know, on the 13th day of the crisis, Khrushchev backed down, the world sighed with relief, and children could stop for a while practicing their hiding under their desks. But the crisis didn't simply evaporate with one radio broadcast. The missiles were still in Cuba, as were dozens of short-range tactical nuclear weapons, nuclear bombers, and tens of thousands of Soviet troops. And it wasn't until nearly 3 weeks after Khrushchev had backed down that the Joint Chiefs of Staff were finally in a position to come into the Oval Office and tell Kennedy, "We are finally fully ready to invade if you tell us to." Helpfully for historians, Kennedy created a remarkable view of what was happening inside the White House during this period. Kennedy taped intensively during the 13 days, but after the 13 days, he kept the tapes rolling. And through those tapes and other documents, we get an intimate view of Kennedy's decision-making in the first weeks in the aftermath of the crisis, as talk of airstrikes and blockades and invasions continued out of the public eye. In those weeks, Kennedy faced a series of decisions about how to protect American interests without flaring up the crisis again or sparking something worse. It may not have had the same high noon character as the 13 days, but it is illuminating about how Kennedy faced national security decision-making. Once Khrushchev promised to remove the missiles, the first order of business was making sure that it wasn't just some trick, that it wasn't just a way of buying time for the Soviet troops to rush to ready the missiles for firing. And after recent events, there was naturally a deep skepticism amongst members of the ex-com that perhaps the Soviets were lying again. Secretary of State Dean Rusk worried that it just might be, he said, a gigantic hoax of which history has had no parallel. Verifying that it wasn't a trick meant sending American surveillance planes over Cuba. One had already been shot down on October 27th, the pilot killed. And others continued to return to base with holes from Cuban bullets. So in a very immediate sense, in the weeks after the Cuban Missile Crisis, after the 13 days, Kennedy is facing difficult decisions about whether to send American pilots into harm's way and what to do if another plane was shot down. In a broader sense, though, the problem was deciding what the United States could and could not live with in Cuba. The Soviets had assembled formidable military presence on the island armed with a lot of sophisticated weapons. As National Security Advisor, George Bundy framed the problem privately for the president in a moment caught on tape. He said it was whether you want to keep the heat on, get the basic Soviet military presence out of Cuba, which means a small war. McGeorge Bundy, with his typical puckishness, said, "My 5-second reaction is to have the small war, but not today." And if they pushed too hard, war was still an all too real possibility. Khrushchev had just been humiliated. And with all due respect to Mr. Khrushchev, his father was not famous in the West for being cool, calm, and collected. So Kennedy did not want to push too hard. The IL-28 bombers were a particular problem, and it's a technical name, but it's a type of Soviet bomber that was obsolete at the time. They were slow, obsolete, and they were no match for the air defense system in southeastern United States. But they were still nuclear bombers. They had a long range. They could easily get within the range of the United States southeastern corner. The Soviets were refusing to remove those. They were not what they called offensive weapons, which is the term that was used in the deal to settle the crisis. But to the Americans, they were offensive weapons. So for 3 weeks, the Americans and Soviets privately argued about the IL-28s as American military planners explored their options for airstrikes to take out the airfields and the IL-28s if necessary. What comes through strikingly in the tapes is that Kennedy himself was one of the least concerned about the bombers. A number of times he says that he doesn't want the deal to get hung up on the bombers, and he confides to Bundy that he thinks they were being unreasonable asking Khrushchev to remove them. But it's Robert McNamara, McGeorge Bundy, and Secretary of State Dean Rusk who pushed the case very hard and said that the United States could not live with long-range nuclear bombers in Cuba. Ultimately, of course, they prevailed. Kennedy agreed to stand firm on the IL-28s, and it was when Khrushchev finally gave in on those two that the November 20 deal was finally struck and the quarantine lifted. Kennedy faced a similar decision with respect to the Soviet combat troops and the short-range tactical nuclear missiles in Cuba. When low-level surveillance flights began on October 23rd, they found something that the high-level U-2 flights had not found, that there were thousands of Soviet combat troops in Cuba organized into 4 regiments. And those 4 regiments were armed with sophisticated battlefield weapons, including short-range, nuclear-capable rockets known in the West as frogs. Kennedy knew it would be a hard case to make that these were offensive weapons. Although tactical nuclear weapons could, in the words of Marine Corps Commandant General David Shoup, deal bloody hell with Guantanamo, they could not reach the United States. And even members of the ExComm conceded that the frogs had not been on the original list, and, as Bundy put it, they were not the missiles we've had on our minds. So while Kennedy and the ExComm are debating how hard to push for the IL-28s, they're also deciding how hard to push on the Soviet troops and their advanced battlefield weapons. By November 29, Kennedy concedes that there's no longer any incentive for Khrushchev to pull out the combat troops and their frogs, unless he's willing to offer a stronger commitment against invasion. And that, he said, was too high a price. So Kennedy navigated those weeks by choosing carefully where to apply pressure. He was forced to compromise on some items, and he was forced to accept a level of risk. The Soviets ultimately agreed to remove the nuclear bombers. The Americans decided not to push explicitly for removal of the short-range missiles, and Khrushchev would be taken at his word that he was going to remove the troops in due time. Of course he didn't, because they resurfaced about a decade and a half later with the Cuban Brigade crisis. But in the weeks after the 13 days, it wasn't just about Cuba. If the tapes of the 6 presidents who secretly taped in the White House tell us anything, it's that presidents don't have the luxury of stovepiping issues the same way that historians or political scientists do. Issues bleed into each other. So in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a midterm election loomed, and Democrats were expected to lose seats. During the summer, Republicans had designated the president's Cuba policy as one of their leading lines of attack. They were suddenly robbed of that issue in what they called an October surprise, so they doubled down on their attacks, accusing the White House of covering up what they knew, of letting the Soviets off too easily, of playing politics with the nation's security, and even manufacturing the crisis in the first place. The press, frustrated with the lack of access and information during the 13 days, was clamoring for more information in the wake of it, and accused the White House of increasingly draconian news management. It had been sparked by some careless truth-telling from Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs Arthur Sylvester, that of course the government used information as a weapon in moments of crisis. That was something everybody knew, but it wasn't something that the press was willing to get the Defense Department to get away with on record. And all the while, Kennedy has an eye on his legacy and an eye on the '64 election. As the postmortems on Cuba flowed and the press and Congress, as political opponents tried to define the missile crisis not as a Kennedy victory, but as a Kennedy failure, Kennedy was also looking ahead to moments like the signing of the Atmospheric Test Ban Treaty and the American University speech. And it's thanks to Kennedy's own tapes then, and to wonderful institutions like the Kennedy Library that make these records accessible, that 50 years later, we're finally getting a good and remarkable window, not only into how Kennedy made decisions in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis and how difficult some of those decisions were, but also how hard it is to be president. Thank you.
So while our next panelists are coming on stage, let me just remind you all, we welcome you to visit our website, jfklibrary.org. On that website, you can search through our digital archives. You can see the newly released documents from the Robert F. Kennedy collection. as well as an interactive website about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we hope that you'll come and visit and spend as much time on our website exploring these fascinating documents. And now our final panel on the lessons learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'll turn it over to Juliette Kayyem.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to moderate this panel, which is essentially about lessons learned with the Cuban Missile Crisis. In so many ways, as those of you who've been listening for the last 5 hours, the crisis was unique, not least of all, because we came so close to the brink of disaster. It has captured our imagination, our fears, our academic insights, and thoughts for half a century now. Its legacy, though, isn't simply about a moment in time, a group of men, a struggle between superpowers. It is also about today and the challenges this nation faces. There are lessons to be learned about policy formation as well as the government deliberative process. It is no coincidence that I sit here with Graham Allison, who changed how we think about decision making and his historic essence of decision. And in many respects, the lessons learned did not take 50 years to unearth. President Kennedy's speech before the American University in June of 1963 was proof that the Cuban Missile Crisis also changed him. So we will spend this time unearthing what has been learned, whether they are the right lessons, and how best to think about the challenges we face today in light of the crisis. And the two people who are probably best to go through this exploration are Ambassador Nick Burns and Professor Graham Allison. From the panel, you may think that the Kennedy School has a monopoly on the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think it's more true that it shows that a school that exists to train the next generation of leaders is destined to treat the Cuban Missile Crisis as the most significant lesson in what constitutes, in Graham's book, as he so rightfully states, the essence of decision. So let's begin with some of those decisions. Graham, if I could start with you about the mythology about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the legacy of that mythology. We tend to think about that America stood strong and Russia folded. And that is, over the years, been proved to be a little bit more complicated. How has that mythology, though, tied, and that belief that sort of Russia folded and America stood strong, how has it tied the hands of future presidents, in particular this one, or the next one, and then focusing on our policy options with Iran and China or any other threat today?
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great opportunity to be here at the JFK Library and the great resources that it's made available. And I think their website is fantastic, and the material that the library is making available on this occasion for those of us who are historians and analysts, but I think also as citizens, to get back into the picture and feel something that's that long ago. And from the discussion today, for those that have been here, I think you've had a great opportunity to see how this is a lively conversation still about an iconic event, the most dangerous moment in recorded history, and why, therefore, continuing to look at it and think about it and ask what the lessons are has been compelling for every president of the U.S. since Kennedy, and for other leaders as they try to think about it. So Julie's exactly right that we continue studying this because it's fascinating in itself, but also because there are lessons that are very relevant for issues that we have today. So Julie, to your specific question, there emerged immediately after the crisis a narrative which actually the Kennedy administration was quite enthusiastic about and played a significant role in maintaining and sustaining, which was that the U.S. found Khrushchev attempting to sneak missiles into Cuba. Kennedy confronted him publicly. He drew a clear red line. He flexed our military muscles. He hung tough. And as the most quoted line, we were eyeball to eyeball, and the other guy just blinked. Now, this was half of the story, at least, and an important half. But it I think, obscured the fact that there was another half of the story, which was crafty, extremely crafty, stealthy, sometimes even deceitful, but always masterful diplomacy, which was a huge part of this, and then that including concessions. So a concession over US missiles in Turkey, which Khrushchev pointed to as essentially equivalent to the missiles in Cuba, which they were, even though we denied that they were. They had been put in there publicly. In the case of Cuba, Khrushchev was trying to sneak them in secretly. But other than that, they looked rather similar. Kennedy was prepared to eliminate those as part of the whole package to get out of a crisis that, as I think came across very well at in the previous panel, that was kind of getting out of control, thinking that, my God, who's in charge of this? Is this going to end up rolling to a nuclear war that I can't pull back? And Khrushchev actually, as Sergei knows very well, coined, I think, one of the best metaphors of this, that we should be careful. We're pulling on this two strings of a rope, and we're going to tie a knot so tightly that the two of us cannot untie it. So I think that this combination of things was crucial in this instance, and I think that because of the mythology is a little bit more in the John Wayne style. Yeah. You know, you confront the guy at the crossroads. If you're tough and you look him in the eye, you can stare him down. But actually, in fact, it was resolved by a much more intelligent process. And I think the lessons that Nick has been pushing us to all think about is diplomacy is not some alternative to all the rest of this. Diplomacy is actually the orchestration of all of this that was in this instance essential, but that we tend to neglect given that it's kind of easier to tell the John Wayne story.
Do you want to follow up on that? Or?
I'd be happy to. And first, let me thank the library and Tom and Amy for this invitation. I must say to you, it's a real pleasure to be in this podium with two Kennedy School colleagues, Juliet certainly, but also Graham. If you're looking at the most insightful American on the Cuban Missile Crisis, he's right there. He wrote the greatest book that the United States has seen, certainly, in Essence of Decision, published in 1971. And I think Graham has made this a major focus of our efforts at the Kennedy School of Government this autumn, to think about the implications here. And I just pick up on Graham's point by saying this. This was a negotiation during these 13 days. It wasn't just a military standoff. It was a decision about whether or not we were going to go to war and whether or not we'd try to entertain the possibility of thinking about a nuclear conflict. Graham has said that the death toll could have risen to hundreds of millions of people on both sides of the divide. And I think the crucial lesson here for us is to understand that in a negotiation, unless you're trying to vanquish the person across the table or at the other end of the phone line, unless you want to win a 100-0 victory, you're going to have to compromise. And when President Kennedy made that fateful agreement that he would essentially trade Jupiter missiles in Turkey in exchange for the withdrawal of Soviet missiles in Cuba, most of the people on the executive committee at the cabinet level briefing President Kennedy and Robert Kennedy had no idea this offer was being made. But in my mind, he saved us. President Kennedy saved us from a nuclear catastrophe, as did Premier Khrushchev. So what's the lesson here? And how might we apply it, say, to Iran? Because we're facing, unfortunately, at least the possibility of a war with Iran in the next couple of years. If we're not trying to destroy Iran, if we're not trying to win a complete victory, you do have to leave your adversary exit doors in a negotiation. You've got to help your adversary stand down, appreciate his or her political situation, as President Kennedy appreciated what Khrushchev was up to in his own system. And on Iran, there must be a way to negotiate our differences that leave us short of a nuclear weapon in Iran. And I think President Kennedy's wisdom in this crisis gives us that channel. So it's a central lesson to me, Juliet.
So let's talk about Iran and an exit strategy, since it's in all the headlines now. What's amazing about the Cuban Missile Crisis is the extent to which it really was an intelligence failure at the beginning. Things were unknown, or the known unknowns, in the words of Donald Rumsfeld. And the president and his team, as well as Khrushchev, were working with imperfect information, lots of assumptions, lots of leaps of faith. So as you think about Iran and sort of the known unknowns, or what we anticipate, how would you advise a president about the lack of information we have, drawing from the Cuban Missile Crisis, and how we should factor those unknowns into our own strategic approach about the issue that seems to get everyone's focus on right now?
Well, again, great question, and it's complicated. So I would say that, on the one hand, the Cuban Missile Crisis was an intelligence success, a significant success, but simultaneously that there were some failures or significant unknowns,
Yes.
which is almost always the case. The world is extremely complicated. I refer sometimes in class to the fog of life. Anybody that thinks they got everything taped has probably not understood the situation. So first, the intelligence successes. Had it not been for a magical set of technological developments, we would have never known the missiles were being constructed in Cuba until after they were completed, and Khrushchev had announced this is a fait accompli. So a US U-2 flying way out of sight, magically, with a camera made here in Boston, actually, by Din Land, the Land Polaroid folks, took pictures of things on the ground that nobody could even imagine happened. And actually, if you look at the Soviet camouflaging of these missiles as they're constructing them, they camouflage them, you know, by putting a wall around it. They're not camouflaging it from somebody looking down from the sky and seeing this, because if they were looking down from the sky, a plane would come over, you would hear it. But this thing is up there at 60,000 feet. You don't hear it coming over, and it's taking these pictures. I mean, it was genuinely magical. So I would say we shouldn't forget that. That if they had known about this capability, they would have camouflaged it, and we wouldn't have known. So that's the reason why Kennedy gets the chance to deliberate, as the last panel said, and think, and prepare the first move. At the same time, as came up at the last panel, here's Kennedy making decisions about an airstrike followed by an invasion, which was clearly his preference the first, second, third, fourth day. So as he said in the video, if he had had to choose right at the beginning, he wouldn't have chosen so wisely. He would have gone with the airstrike. I mean, if you look at these new papers that Tom and company have just opened at the library, the RFK papers, you can see Bobby's handwritten comments that says on this is second or third day, we're going to have to go in, and we have to go in hard, which means, go. Okay. Well, those forces, as they come on the beaches, would have been attacked by tactical nuclear weapons that Kennedy didn't even know were there. So you look and you think, whoa, okay. So now you take the Iran case. What do we know and what do we not know? Just what you said. So about Iran, we have a pretty good picture of the fact that they're enriching uranium. They got 10,000 centrifuges. They've been operating for 10 years. They got about 7,000 pounds or 7 tons of low enriched uranium, enough for a half dozen bombs after further enriched. Because the IAEA inspectors, the international inspectors, go look, see what. So I'd say we have a pretty good picture of that. What we don't know about is any facility that has not been declared or discovered. So Fordo, the place that the Iranians have recently been installing centrifuges deep underground, was a secret facility for 4 years while it was being constructed until it was discovered. So what's the likelihood that we've discovered all of the facilities in Iran that are relevant to Iran's nuclear program? I mean, I've said in a different context, if that's the case, the Iranian nuclear program manager should be fired. What is he going to keep all of his activity, all of his eggs under the Klieg lights with international inspectors coming and seeing them? So as you try to think about the airstrike option, which is on the table now for Iran, one thing for sure, you cannot destroy any target that you haven't identified. Right. So if we had attacked, as was the plan, in Cuba with the airstrikes, we would have destroyed every facility that we identified. But the tactical nuclear weapons would not have been destroyed because we didn't know they're there. So I think it's a big, big reminder, this kind of known unknowns, that it's extremely implausible that we have a good fix on all of the elements of this. And I think that's yet another reason why the lessons of the missile crisis relevant for Iran would suggest, just as Nick said, that, well, we got to find some way to reach an agreement for them to stop short of a nuclear bomb, because our opportunities to assure that this happens otherwise are not very good.
Nick, I want to follow up on that and talk a little bit where you come from, your history at the State Department and leadership at the State Department. So the Cuban Missile Crisis happens, and then about 6 months later, President Kennedy gives a speech which was as significant, perhaps, as any he gave. Can you tell the audience a little bit about that speech? And as importantly, how does it frame the State Department in terms of their thinking about threats today, or the challenges that they face as the sort of key diplomatic organization for the United States?
Well, I think the short answer to that question, Juliet, is there's no substitute for knowledge of history. President Kennedy studied history at Harvard College and loved to read history throughout his entire life. There's no substitute for understanding the person across from you in an adversarial relationship in international politics. And there's no substitute for wisdom, but wisdom is so elusive. You can't study at any university to get a PhD in wisdom. You get it from your life experience, you have it or don't. And I agree with Juliet. I reread the June 10th, 1963 American University Commencement speech this morning. I teach it at the first week of all my classes at the Kennedy School. I ask the students to watch it, because if you go on the library website, you can watch the speech. I think it's the most important speech given by an American president in the last 50 years. I mean, here's what that speech did. I went through it this morning. It asked us to break fundamentally from this psychology of the Cold War where we demonized each other, first. Secondly, President Kennedy made this very crucial distinction between the human interest and the national interest. Obviously, his job as American president was to pursue the national interest, protect this country, which he did quite well. But I think it dawned on him, and Graham might have a sense of this, 8 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, that the human interest was more important here, that he and Premier Khrushchev might have destroyed the lives of several hundred million of us. Many of us were living in October 1962. So he's got that crucial distinction, which I think in 2012 is very important for us to remember. In an era of chemical weapons and biological weapons and terrorism, the human interest is paramount. Third, there's this wonderful passage in the speech, some of the most beautiful prose, I think, of any American president in our history, where President Kennedy really talks about globalization, a global world. You all know this quote. He says, "For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal." That is the president saying to us, we are interconnected in this world, and the decisions that a powerful country like the United States makes affects everybody, and certainly he was cognizant of that in 1962 during the crisis, but especially when he reflected on it. And finally, I think a very powerful part of this speech, Juliet, the American University speech, he essentially said, we need a strategy of peace. When was the last time we heard one of our political leaders, Democrat or Republican, say, I'm for peace? You know, since 9/11, our leaders, quite rightly, have been saying, I'm for security. Vote for me, I'll build the walls higher. But President Kennedy, at an equally dangerous time during the Cold War, said, no, actually, the highest objective should be peace, and we Americans need a strategy for it. And he said, do not demonize. He said, I call on my fellow Americans, don't demonize the Soviet peoples. We have to see the possibility of reaching across this ideological divide and somehow connecting with them and stepping back from the psychological precipice of war. I just really would encourage you, if you have any, all you need is 7 minutes. Go on the Tom Putman's website, the Kennedy Library website, and look at it. It's a powerful set of messages for us today.
Let me just pick up for a second, because I agree completely with what Nick said. And I would say if you want to do actually better than listening to the rest of the panel, go quickly and push the button. It's a terrific, terrific speech. Deserves to be read and deserves to be heard. It's well delivered, but if you just read it even, it just is a thrilling speech. And all the things Nick said, I agree with completely. But to go back to the last panel, I think if we said, what does the president say, now that he's thought about this over some time, that is his main takeaway from the crisis? And is it that, okay, now we know how to do this. We're smarter, we played this hand, I'm pretty confident we can do this again and we'll be successful. That would be theory 1, or theory 2, which is, whoa, this was so dangerous, it almost got out of control. We should give thanks for the fact that we escaped in this instance, and we should never, never, never get into a confrontation like this again. He is in theory 2, and he says, let me quote, because this is, I always do for my class the same thing I say. He says, while defending our national interests, quote, we must avert confrontations that force an adversary to choose between humiliating retreat and war. So wait a minute. So we must avert crises. So we can't get into confrontations like this that give an adversary only 2 choices, humiliating retreat or war. And so after the crisis, and you can see this immediately getting into his head in the immediate establishment of the hotline between the U.S. and Moscow so that people can talk directly, the limited test ban treaty, the beginning of the negotiations that lead to the non-proliferation treaty, which holds back the spread of nuclear weapons, and then so brilliantly in this American University speech, a president that's about a very different agenda than he was before. And actually, the other piece of this that I do for my classes, Kennedy talked in that context about what he called, quote, the precarious rules of the status quo. It's an odd phrase, but, quote, the precarious rules of the status quo, which he thought through the missile crisis, he and Khrushchev and their associates should learn. And these rules of the status quo were that you can't do things like Khrushchev taking such a Brinksman-like act to put missiles in Cuba within our zone of core interests, surprising people. No, that's not going to work. And actually, interestingly, because Cuba was paired with the Berlin crisis, which then was supposed to have occurred in November, but which got shelved, this became a turning point, maybe the major turning point in the Cold War, where ever thereafter, neither side took a venture as adventuresome as putting missiles in Cuba, but recognized that we got to live together in some way, we got to survive in some way. We can't take another chance that would put us back in a confrontation that would play this hand over again. Because Kennedy thought there was a very good chance that whatever he did, this was still going to end in a nuclear war.
I think that what both of you are describing between war and peace, there's a lot of gray. And a lot of relationships between nations that fall into that area. And so one in particular today is China, obviously, neither enemy nor ally, much more complicated than that. And Graham, you were just discussing ensuring that your enemy or another nation has a way out without humiliation, and that you give options. So can you talk a little bit about U.S. relationship with China in the absence of Soviet Union as sort of the double superpower? We have an emerging superpower. We have the United States, debating its own exceptionalism. Lots more complicated than it was 50 years ago.
Oh my goodness, we're going to.
We're going to travel the world.
Yeah, no, and I think Juliet is always challenging because I think thinking of the lessons of the missile crisis and say, how do they apply the things on the current agenda is exactly the right idea. Actually, let me give a little advertisement. On the CubanMissileCrisis.org, if you go to that website, there's a contest for lessons of the missile crisis in which you can win an iPad. Okay? So there's 3 categories. There's for professionals, like professors, there's for college students, and there's for high school students. And I think the deadline is midnight, October 16. So look at the website. There's still a chance. You just write your lesson in, with a little explanation in less than 300 words. And we and Foreign Policy are jointly doing this, and you could win an iPad. So that would, and if you could think of a better answer than the one I can for China, that would be great. Okay, let me go back to China for a second. So big picture for China. China's emergence over the last generation is the furthest, fastest growth of power on all dimensions of any state ever in history. So this is a shocker. A country that was, whose economy was smaller than Spain in 1980 is now the second largest economy in the world, and it'll be the first largest economy in the world in the next decade. So, whoa, okay, for Americans. I've called this the problem of Thucydides' trap. Now, I won't give you my Thucydides lecture, but Thucydides talked about what happens when a rising power rivals a ruling power. So Athens rose, shocked Sparta. He says that made inevitable the Peloponnesian War. But if you look in general, one of our colleagues, Rosecrans, has done this look in 11 of 15 cases since 1500. When rising power challenges ruling power, war. So think of World War I, Germany rises, challenges Britain, war. Now, it's not inevitable, so 4 cases turned out okay. US rose, challenged Britain, accommodation, so there's some lessons there. But in the case of China, unless the US and China can work out some rules, precarious rules of the status quo or some mode of accommodation, it's very likely that China will challenge things that Americans think to be our core interest, or that we'll challenge things to be their core interest. And the best set of candidates for that right now, we can see every week in the paper, is the so-called South China Sea. There's a bunch of islands there. Some of them are claimed, all of them are claimed by China. All of the rest of them are claimed by somebody else. The Japanese say the Senkakus are theirs. The Philippines say these islands are theirs. The Indonesians say these islands are theirs. The South Koreans say these are. So there's a lot of Vietnamese, a lot of competing claims. The U.S. has been the guarantor of security in that whole space. And the U.S. Navy believes we own that space. So if and as China becomes to confront and contest with one of these other countries, these islands, the question is going to be, what's the U.S. Navy going to do? If the Chinese and the Japanese get into a conflict over the Senkakus, the Japanese are our treaty-bound allies. How are we going to become engaged? So working through some understood rules about how one accommodates, and accommodates in a way that doesn't necessarily give us all of what we want, I think would be the place to go. But Nick is our super diplomat. So Nick,
Yeah.
how would you solve that part?
Thanks a lot, Greg.
It's just a minor country.
Thanks for that softball. I would add 2 points to what Graham has said. First, in a way, if there's any hope here as we look at the relationship between China and the United States, I don't think it's nearly as dangerous as the US-Soviet rivalry of the 50s and 60s. That was an ideological rivalry. And in a sense, both of us were out to win the Cold War. And that's why the American University's speech is so important. President Kennedy says we can't win. We can't try to win it because we've got to preserve humanity and fall short of a nuclear conflict. And I do think the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis are in the minds of every global leader that's a nuclear weapon power, and China and the United States are both such powers. That's the first point. I don't think this is as dangerous a crisis. But secondly, there are 193 nation states in the world. The most complicated, challenging relationship we Americans will have, certainly in the next 50 to 60 years, will be with China, because we've got this tension in our relationship. I think, Julia, it's the way you phrased it. We are friend and foe. China's our largest, single economic partner and will be for the foreseeable future. We're tied together economically in a symbiotic way. We can't live without each other. But on the other hand, we're strategic rivals. And so you see the United States under President Obama, I think quite rightly, the president's been very, I think, intelligent to say we ought to be pivoting our strategic attention as Americans to Asia. That's where we have this alliance system. South Korea, Australia, Japan, the United States are allies. We have defense arrangements with the Philippines and Thailand. We have an emerging strategic partnership with India. We're all democratic. We want to keep Asia and the Pacific democratic. And at the same time, China's going to want to rise. It's going to, militarily, it's going to emerge from its isolation. It's going to want to assert itself. We're seeing that in the South China Sea. So how do you have this very close economic relationship and yet have a strategic competition? We're going to have that. Can we keep the peace, avoid a catastrophic war? It's going to take wisdom. and a sense of real diplomacy and of balancing two objectives that are in tension with each other. But there really is no other way to look at this, because we need to preserve this leading strategic role for the United States. Too many people in Asia are depending on us, and one of the great ironies these days as an American is to travel in Asia. It's one thing for the Japanese and South Koreans to say, please maintain the American Navy and Air Force as the preeminent power in Asia. But when our Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, went to Vietnam a couple of months ago, they said, please visit Cam Ranh Bay. A lot of us of a certain age will remember that's where the American Navy had its hub during the Vietnam War. The Vietnamese want us to come back because the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and of course Vietnam and China have been rivals for 1,000 years. So we're seeing among all the littoral states of the South China Sea island chains, all these countries saying to the United States, don't leave Asia, you know, sustain your military power, because the only way to live in peace with China is to have a power, the United States, that can be that balancing power. So it's critically important.
Well, Nick, picking up on that point, I'm going to turn to you first, because the Cuban Missile Crisis isn't only about substantive lessons learned, but also process issues about how a president comes to a decision making. And in reviewing some of the materials for this, I was amazed to the extent, you know, how Castro and Cuba's interests were essentially purposefully sort of left out of the room, that this was going to be between the two superpowers and between the two leaders. Now we're in a world of multi-nation institutions, the UN, and then you think about the Arab Spring, Arab organizations, Latin American organizations, other interests that that are not so easy to silence in a world in which, you know, there's globalization. You can think about Israel's interest in what's happening in Iran. You can sort of add these third-party interests. How can you manage both the necessity of that sort of tete-a-tete that was so crucial to both Kennedy and Khrushchev's resolution, but being open enough to, hey, this isn't a world of superpowers anymore. There are other very important interests, the Arabs or the Africans or the Latin Americans. If you're advising sort of a new president or this president on thinking about that difficult balance?
Well, it's a great question. I guess I'd say that, you know, what was key for President Kennedy was that he had a little bit of time and space. He had 13 days. I thought bureaucratically he did the right thing. He got a lot of very smart people, powerful people, but some of them were rivals around one table and said, you know, help me think this through. He was very wise to understand that some of those people may have thought more deeply about some of these strategic implications than he had time to do, but he had the decision-making power. And he was wise to reserve that to himself and not to make this a group exercise in decision-making, because, as Graham has said, the vast majority of this group of very wise men at the time, I don't think there were any women around the table at the time, would have had us embark on a much more aggressive policy that might have led to war. And I think this is his greatest moment as president. It's one of the great moments in the American presidency, going back to Washington, when he had enough intellectual courage in his own reason, in his own wisdom, with his brother and with Ted Sorensen and others, to say, I'm going to defy the majority here, and I'm going to do what I think is right. And boy, was he right. And we have the benefit now of some of the historical records here at the Kennedy Library to know he was right. But the second point, Juliet, would be to say, we are in a different time now. We're still the most powerful country in the world, without any question, but, you know, the relative power has shifted. And China and India and Brazil are closer to us, and the European Union certainly economically closer to us. So I hope we'll never have a crisis like the Cuban Missile Crisis, but when we deal with climate change, or whether to, you know, assert ourselves in Syria to save people being killed there, you need to have an American leader who can reach out, who has credibility and respect in other capitals, who is broad-minded enough to want to listen to other leaders and not think that he or she has all the answers. And in that respect, and I don't want to be political today, but I'll just say this. I think that President Obama is a very modern leader, because as I see him over the last nearly 4 years, what he has done is he's gone out and broadened the American leadership circle. He has actively courted Manmohan Singh as a friend and counselor in India. He's developed very close relations with the Brazilian leadership, now with Dilma Rousseff. He's reached out, I think, in a very democratic way to widen this decision-making circle. And we're going to need that in a globalized age. We can't just reserve these decisions for ourselves of war and peace and life and death. We've got to have a leadership circle, and I think President Obama's been able to build one, which gives me some hope that if he ended up in a crisis like this, he'd have the ability to make a wise decision.
Do you want to follow up on that, Graham?
I agree with Nick as always, or almost always, but I would say to get back to just one kind of hard nub of this, in the missile crisis, fortunately, as I think was rather effectively discussed at the previous panel, at the end there were two players, and Castro was eager to get in the game. He was frustrated as hell that he was left out of the game, that he'd been pushed aside. He was just running a location. When he had a chance to get in the game, all he wanted to do was push towards war. I think that came up quite clearly through. So the success of both Kennedy and Khrushchev, in effect, in sidelining his impact on events, was frustrating to him, but fortunate for us. So when Kennedy first announces that the missiles have been discovered, in this first speech, there's a chilling line that I always, again, quote. It says, quote, any attack emanating from Cuba, when any target in the Western Hemisphere will be regarded by the U.S. as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring, and here's the chiller, a full retaliatory response, which meant, how about nuclear war? Yeah. Okay? So you think, wait a minute, what if Castro should be the actor? So this was basically reminding Khrushchev, these are your missiles, this is your problem, you got this thing started, and so we're holding you accountable. Okay? Now today, if you look at the Iranian crisis, well, there's us, and there's the Iranians, but there's the Israelis. They're a totally independent actor in this picture. Now you can see in the struggle that's been going on, and Nick and I have been in 2 days of intense meetings that just started today, or stopped yesterday at lunchtime, with some Israeli friends doing this, that they, as one of them said rightly, no Israeli government of any stripe is going to ask the U.S. for permission to defend Israel's national security, if that's what it concludes. We understand that this may have consequences, but now, and then similarly, the reason why the P5+1, that is the permanent 5 of the UN plus Germany, have been doing the negotiations with Iran is that they all have great stakes in this. Yeah. So an American president who said, well, gee, this is complicated, I don't want to have too many actors, I'll just do this all by myself, that would be nice and clarifying, but you couldn't really get away with that today.
Right. What you also couldn't get away with, talking about the process issue, is 13 days. It's the luxury of time, made decisions. We were lucky to have the luxury of time. So instead of wishing that we had the luxury of time, which I don't think is going to happen, what are ways in which a president and his staff or national security staff could think about replicating the luxury of time afforded Kennedy and his ex-com team? Is that possible?
My goodness. This is one that I wrestle with all the time, and I thought actually the library did a great job with the Kennedy video earlier, because Kennedy says, if we had to decide quickly, we would have chosen, he didn't say the airstrike, but that's what he meant. Yeah. He was saying, we would not have chosen so wisely. So let's just imagine that Kennedy thought he had only 48 hours, and he had to make the first move, and he made a decision, and he had the airstrike, and this led to a nuclear war. You know, okay. So the idea of having time in private, in secret, to think, to deliberate, to take your first judgment, but then subject it to conflicting evidence, to competing views, to change your mind, I would say that luxury a president needs if he's going to make wise decisions. Yeah. And how how to try to square that circle with the 24/7 news cycle, with pervasive press, with not just the responsible press, but all this surround. I think, I think that's an issue, that's a problem. Interestingly, in the case of Osama bin Laden,
Right.
a case that I've studied as well, there, Obama, after having heard from CIA, they've got a pretty good fix on this guy, takes 4 months. Now, he does it by drawing the circle so tight that most of the people who should be part of the decision process aren't really in the room. So there's a great cost to that because you're losing perspectives that you would otherwise should have as part of the consultation. But I think the dilemma that you point to is just right. And if you ask, well, if Kennedy had to choose in 48 or 72 hours, maybe he would have just been a smarter, faster learner, maybe. But maybe he would have done what he said he was going to do. And if I listen to the tapes, I'm pretty confident if it has to go in 48 hours, they go with the airstrike.
Did you want to follow up on that in terms of sort of the deliberative process and how fast-paced they are? I mean, you think about, you've been very involved in your colleague about what happened in Benghazi. And Biden, this is just narrative more than anything, but Biden explaining that the intelligence changes over time. So, you have a statement the first minute, it is going to be different than the statement the next day, then a statement a week later. But we don't allow people to change, modify, accept the facts as they move. And so, I find that one of the most sort of troubling differences between what you see Kennedy and his team have and what goes on with any president now. And is there a way to try to resolve that, or are we sort of doomed to it?
Well, I think the environment in which our leaders work in 2012 is entirely different than the environment that President Kennedy knew in 1962. We're in a 24-hour news cycle. The first question that you now have to answer in any national security crisis in the Situation Room of the White House is, what do we say?
Yeah.
And when I started my career as a lowly intern for the State Department in 1980, it was, diplomacy was an interior game. It was behind a curtain, and secrets were kept. And the press was limited. I remember when I was State Department spokesman in the mid-90s for the Clinton administration, I could go home at 7 at night because the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and Washington Post, they had closed. The evening news, Walter Cronkite, well, he was off the air. And now, of course, this is a 24-hour game. So the first thing that President Obama has to consider in a national security crisis is, what do I say to my public? What do I say to the rest of the global community? That was probably 14th on President Kennedy's list at the beginning of the Executive Committee in '62. Second, I think President Obama has been right to push for openness. One of his big initiatives in 2009 was, can we make the government more transparent? Can we reduce classification timelines? Maybe not 30 years, but 10 or 15 years in terms of the dates at which you declassify a document. But governments do have to have some secrets. We have nuclear codes for our nuclear weapons. We can't make those public, right? Not every citizen has a right to know everything the government is doing. And so I think Graham's example is a good one. In a crisis nowadays, the president needs to carve out with a very small circle, smaller than President Kennedy's Executive Committee, his decision-making so that he avoids the possibility of leak. And finally, I'd say, I don't understand this attack on the Obama administration, frankly, by Governor Romney and Paul Ryan, that somehow the administration has been misleading the public in what happened in Benghazi. I've been in a situation like that, both at embassies and also in Washington. You can't believe the first reports that come in. You do try to establish a sense of what happened in the first 24 hours. You have a duty to communicate that to the public. But if the story changes because your sense of what happened changes, then of course you've got to change what you say publicly. I find what the administration has done entirely credible and believable based on my own experience in government. And I'm sorry to see that this situation in the Middle East, the attacks on our embassies have been politicized. This is a time for us to stand together when our diplomats are being attacked. I think it's a grave era of the Romney campaign to try to politicize this.
Let me just put
it's a great point. Graham?
I think I think Nick is precisely right, and I remember when Nick was the U.S. ambassador to Greece in Athens, and his house was fired on by an RPG that went through the window and almost hit your family. That was your wife and children were there. And the question was, what happened? Well, it was clear that somebody had fired something, and it was easy enough to determine, but it took a week more to figure out, and the proposition that at the beginning there's a great deal of confusion, that as McNamara rightly said in that fog of war, your first report is always wrong in some significant way. So always to change mind. The expectation that then one should be omniscient at the beginning is completely unrealistic. And I think that actually we do ourselves a disservice as a society, as citizens, and as reporters or newspapers or otherwise, are suggesting that it could be otherwise. The president can't be omniscient. You couldn't possibly know what had happened other than the fact that, thank God, you guys and your family survived.
And as it turns out, there wasn't an RPG fired into our house, but there were Greek terrorist groups that were threatening us. They did fire some RPGs, luckily not at us, but you're right about that. I mean, governments have a right, as you suggested, Juliet, to change their minds and not to be called inconsistent, because when further information comes in, you have a better appreciation of what has happened.
I think that's right. I want to ask one final question, and it's a short question, but one that I hope the audience will appreciate. Based on the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis, if you could have 10 minutes with any world leader, any, enemy, friend, whoever in between, and describe or teach them about one day, one moment, one decision during that 13 days, who would it be today, and what would the lesson be? And it can't be Castro, because as we learned in the previous panel, he won the Cuban Missile Crisis. He's still around.
Well, if you said, yeah, who's still here?
Yeah.
I remember Khrushchev said he was going to bury us.
Right.
Kennedy said he was going to bury Castro. I think Castro was still
Castro
here.
wins.
Yes. So I think that the most urgent nuclear challenge on the agenda today is Iran. And I think Iran's nuclear challenge looks like a Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion. In the missile crisis, in 13 days, we rushed up to the edge of a precipice and almost fell over. Here, maybe the next 13 months, you can see the parties moving inexorably to a confrontation that'll look a lot like the Cuban Missile Crisis. There in the missile crisis, at the last day, the 27th, that was being discussed, two choices: attack to prevent the missiles being able to fire against the U.S., acquiesce in Cuba becoming a strategic offensive nuclear weapons base. In that last minute, Kennedy became super inventive and developed this package that was being discussed before that included a public deal, a private ultimatum, and a secret sweetener. And that combination was what led to the successful resolution of the crisis. He would have rejected that proposal if you had given it to him the week before. Right. But when he looked over the precipice and thought about what the consequences of each of the options would be, he became to be inventive. I think it's time on the Iranian case, before we get to attack or acquiesce, to become much more inventive about options that'll be ugly, that we won't like, that we wouldn't want, that we wouldn't choose, except for the fact that it's better than two other options that are worse.
So really, we could design an entire course at the Kennedy School around Juliet's question, but I guess I'd say this. I don't think that Castro was the victor of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He sits as a discredited figure in isolation in a communist country. He's an anachronism. I think President Kennedy is the great hero of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Without him, and without his ability to think his way through this and arrive at a decision that most of his advisors told him was not correct, we would very likely have ended up in a catastrophic conflict. So I think he's the hero. What lesson do we draw for Iran? Your question, I'd want to have 10 minutes with the Supreme Leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei. And if Graham and I could do that meeting together, because Graham's smarter than I am in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Here's what Graham and I might say to him. What did President Kennedy do correctly to arrive at a successful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis 50 years ago today? He combined diplomacy and force. He was smart enough to say to Khrushchev, I can inflict unacceptable military damage on you, but I'd rather us find a way to back off and find some agreement that leaves us both and our countries peaceful. And that's what we've got to do with Iran. I don't think we can allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon, and for all sorts of reasons, but I think everyone will understand why. But we shouldn't choose to fight them if we can possibly avoid it, because who knows where that will lead. Who knows if it'll be another 10-year land war in the Middle East with unacceptable losses on both sides. So I'd say to the Ayatollah Khamenei, see what President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev were able to do. They were mortal enemies, and yet they had the human insight to understand that war was unacceptable. Is there some agreement, Mr. Supreme Leader, that you could accept that would allow him to walk away with his pride intact, short of a nuclear weapon, that we could accept? And should we do something that we haven't done in 32 years between the United States and Iran? Can we have a conversation that is strategic and sustained? We haven't had such a conversation since the Jimmy Carter administration. We are totally divorced from each other. I think Graham and I would both choose that meeting with the Ayatollah Khamenei, and I think the Cuban Missile Crisis gives us a lot of lessons for the U.S. and Iran relationship to avoid war. I think we can do it.
I hope so too. I want to thank both Ambassador Burns and Graham Allison, and thank you.
Change the stage for our last act. Yep. As my colleagues are doing so, let me introduce our next speaker. As we know, the election of John F. Kennedy represented a profound shift in American politics, bringing to power, quote, a new generation, described by JFK in his inaugural as born in this century, tempered by war, and disciplined by a hard and bitter peace. When his wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, founded this library, she expressed her hope that it would be not only a memorial to President Kennedy, but a vital center of education and exchange and thought which will grow and change with the times and will inspire the ideals of democracy and freedom in young people around the world. I was at a meeting recently marking a transition in leadership here, and it was suggested that a baton was being passed, at which I quipped that here at the Kennedy Library we pass torches, not batons. We cannot think of a more fitting way to end this conference than to hear from a representative of the next generation of Americans, President Kennedy's grandson, Jack Schlossberg, who is currently a sophomore at Yale University. Jack.
On behalf of the Kennedy Library and my family, I want to thank you all for coming to my grandfather's presidential library. And thank all the speakers who are here with us today. This is a special place that holds many memories for me, that many people, including my mother and father, have worked hard to make worthy of President Kennedy's legacy. I want to especially thank David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and Sergei Khrushchev, who I was honored to meet during these proceedings. The Cuban Missile Crisis is now part of America's storied history. It's a signature moment of the 20th century. That we are here, together, to remember today is a testament to the wisdom of my grandfather and all those who, 50 years ago, braved the most trying 13 days in our nation's history. My grandfather would love this event, not just because every Irishman loves a bit of praise, but because today we are here to bear witness to the past for the sake of our future. Admirers of President Kennedy know that he was a student of history. I try to be, and as I study my grandfather, the man and the president, I believe his greatest asset was indeed his understanding of the past. The inspiration he found in the achievements of others are what guided him through the crisis. It's what inspired him to send a man to the moon, and it is what compelled him to search for a lasting peace. President Kennedy is known for his own inspiring words, but he also looked to the great men of history for guidance, just as I do to him. He knew that the problems of the 1960s had their counterparts in other struggles. In his address at Rice University in 1962, President Kennedy quoted William Bradford, speaking in 1630 of the founding of the Plymouth Bay Colony, who said that all great and honorable actions are accompanied with great difficulty, and both must be enterprised and overcome with answerable courage. I think he would tell my generation the same thing today. We have grown up in tumultuous times. Our outlook has been shaped by 9/11. We have been burdened by 2 misguided wars that have damaged our credibility abroad. We have experienced an economic crisis unlike any other since the Great Depression. We have watched our environment head toward disaster and our government stand at an impasse. We have been told over and over that America is no longer the great country it was when my grandfather was president. But President Kennedy would not be discouraged by these great challenges. He would not give corner to defeat. He would not, as he said in his inaugural address, shrink from the responsibility to meet these challenges. He would welcome it. He would tell us to look to the challenges that past generations faced, fighting the Civil War to right an unspeakable wrong, entering World War II to defeat a pervasive evil, or marching on Washington to demand the basic civil rights all men deserve. Americans have always faced seemingly insurmountable obstacles. President Kennedy would tell us, as he did in 1962, quoting the explorer George Mallory, that we should climb the highest mountain because it is there. My grandfather described himself as an idealist without illusions. He would not propose to my generation that any of this would be easy, or that we would not face constant opposition from those who, to quote him directly, would have us stand where we are a little longer, to rest and to wait. Though we look back on my grandfather's presidency as one with many successes, we must not forget that those 3 years were not absent of partisan gridlock or disappointment or immense frustration. Yet from those years emerged accomplishments of which he was very proud, chief among them the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. To me, that treaty, which sought to limit the danger of nuclear confrontation, is the most inspiring aspect of his presidency. Today we remember our nation's closest encounter with nuclear war, an encounter that, if not for the president's steady leadership, may have resulted in mutually assured destruction. How incredible it is that just after the missile crisis, man took his first steps to slow the arms race. That gives me hope. It gives me hope in an age when my generation is told that sea levels will rise and kill millions of people, that our debt is so large we'll never be able to pay it back, that the idea of Middle East peace is only for those idealists who are full of illusions. It gives me hope that we too will be able to avert disasters and turn them into triumphs. I'm confident that my generation will follow in my grandfather's footsteps and learn from our storied past. If we do, and I believe we will know, as President Kennedy told Americans in 1961, that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own. Thank you.
That's great. Very good. You can have a seat. You can wait. Listen. As he explained in his remarks, Dr. Sergei Khrushchev is asked to present a special half-ruble coin that was minted in Russia to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the peaceful crisis of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and who better to accept it for the library than Jack Schlossberg. But before he does, I'll read just a portion of President Kennedy's commencement address at American University that hasn't been read yet, in June of 1963. Genuine peace must be the product of many nations, the sum of many acts. It must be dynamic, not static, changing to meet the challenge of each new generation. For peace is a process, a way of solving problems. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered lacking in virtue. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help them make the world safe for diversity. I cannot imagine a more potent symbol of a world that has been made safer for diversity than this next moment when the son of one world leader during the Cuban Missile Crisis meets the grandson of the other, now on this stage and an environment made safer by the actions of their forebears, Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy. So you just need them out in front of us. Thank you all so very much for coming.